Welcome everyone to our 2023 Sustainability Symposium. We are expecting a few more people and I think they'll be joining imminently, but some of the eagle-eyed amongst you will realise that I'm not Dr. Kay Hack. Hopefully she'll join us very soon and she'll be our conference chair for today. I'm Kim Ansell, Senior Consultant for Leadership and Governance at Advance HE. And I'm delighted to see some familiar and some new names and faces for our event today. We've got a track record at this event for sharing good and innovative practice and challenging ourselves to always do more on the ESD agenda. I'm sure that this will continue today and tomorrow. Briefly, I've just got a few housekeeping comments for you. So we ask you to keep your cameras turned off and your microphones muted. This will just enable us to smoothly be able to hear presenters and take questions. And in terms of questions, please put them in the chat if you can, or also feel free to raise your virtual hand and I will keep a lookout, or Kay will keep a lookout when she joins us for those questions coming in. We are doing live captioning today, so if you need the live captioning, please select the closed captions option to activate that. And if you experience any technical issues, our great team is on hand today. Lucy from Advance HE is here supporting us, and there'll always be an Advance HE colleague in each of the breakout rooms to deal with any technical issues or logistics that you have. So please do privately message them if you have any questions that you need to deal with. And so to the programme, next slide please. Our institutions have a dual role: to be sustainable institutions themselves and to ensure that our graduates go on to embed sustainable practices in their social and economic endeavours in the future. On that note, I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Douglas Bourn, Director of the Development of Education Research Centre at the University College London. His work focuses on understanding global skills and education for social change. He is chair of the Academic Network on Global Education and Learning, delightfully summarised as ANGEL, and has a range of chair and advisory roles past and present, including to UK government and internationally such as OECD. Professor Bourn is speaking to us today on the topic of sustainability education, a pedagogy of hope for global social justice. Professor Bourn.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I'm just now going to see if I can share my screen. Right. Is that okay?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. So I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you today, which looks very interesting program for 2 days, and I'm hoping to dip into some of the other events later on today and tomorrow. So just to say a little bit about me and the context in which I'm speaking to you today. I'm, as well as being Professor of Development Education at UCL, I've also been involved in some of their work on sustainability and global perspectives in education, and have a lifelong interest on how we can promote learning for us all to operate in a more global and sustainable way. And my presentation today will try and pose some questions about what education for sustainable development means in the context of the current global context within which we're all living, and also to raise issues and questions about how we promote a pedagogical approach that engenders a sense of hope and directly addresses fears of the future and a sense of hopelessness that we know exists amongst many young people. And I always make reference to issues around the current global context and the impact of climate change. And also I want to make reference in passing to the role of international bodies such as UNESCO, who are perhaps the leading international body in promoting education for sustainable development. But underpinning a lot of my ideas and thinking and my writing is the influence of the Brazilian educationist Paulo Freire. Some of his disciples are now talking about the term eco-pedagogy to make some of those connections between the environment and global questions. But I think what behind a lot of what I'm talking about today is that how can we as educationalists promote a sense of optimism and that change is possible in addressing today's global challenges. And that partly relates to things I've been writing about recently, inspired by Paulo Freire's, this concept of a pedagogy of hope. And I think the reason I'm come to talk about that in this context is we just know the current global context within which we're living in. And I think it's fair to say that as we're starting to be towards sort of midterm in the third decade of the 21st century, that there are things happening in the world around us that are really very challenging for us all. We all know the impact of the global pandemic and the impact it had on our daily lives. Also, how it demonstrated how interconnected we all are, and how it showed that globalization has had an impact upon all our lives and has a variety of implications, social, economic, and cultural. Secondly, we're all, I think, aware of the impact that climate change is having upon us all, of our own communities and the wider world, and the extent to which climate change has risen up the political agendas, as well as obviously the educational agenda, is, I'm sure, something that we're all aware of, and no doubt in these next 2 days, that'll be one of the things people want to talk about quite a lot. But we should also not forget that we're also living in quite challenging times in a European context because of the global, the impact of war and the impact of that war on not only societies and economies around the world, but has caused a lot of unease, particularly amongst young people in many countries around the world. And the sense about this living in uncertain and in challenging times is something we all need to recognize. So I think, to me, that it is in that context that I really want to talk to you today, but also recognizing that some of the things that I might be referring to, there's also a sense that we are living in a time when in higher education, there's still many challenges. There's still the dominance of neoliberal thinking. There's still a very much emphasis on assessment and testing and all areas of education and learning. And many of the things that we might see as essential to promoting sustainable development come up with a lot of economic, social, and I would say political challenges. I'm having problems with my clicker. Hopefully it works better now. But in this context, therefore, the Sustainable Development Goals are therefore a very important framework for some of our thinkings. Now, there's lots of debates about how relevant and how important they are today. There's been criticisms about that they've tailored too much to the dominant neoliberal thinking. But I would, whilst I accept and agree with many of those comments, I also feel that Sustainable Development Goals have provided an opening and a space to talk about the things that hopefully we'll be talking about these 2 days. And also to promote the connections between what often has been quite narrow interpretations about the environment to broader issues around peace and social justice. And that, to me, is one of the things I think is particularly important, one of the things I want to come to. And that is why I found particularly target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals particularly useful. Although, again, it could be seen as like a shopping list of the sort of topics and issues, there is a sense, I think, by under the umbrella of education for sustainable development, making connections to themes about human rights, about gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity. To me, by trying to bring those things together, it shows in a way that they are interconnected. And that, I presume, that is, I would say, is one of the major themes of my talk today, is that when we talk about education and sustainable development and want to live more sustainable lives, whatever areas of education we're involved with, it inevitably and should touch upon a whole range of other issues and topics. It's not something that should be put in a nice little box on the side. It has implications about how you organize our daily lives, how we interact with people. And it does connect quite closely, I would suggest, to questions particularly around rights, gender, and peace, and the sense of how we see ourselves in the wider world. And there are many different cultural interpretations of how we see sustainable development. And I think as educators, we have a role and responsibility to raise all those questions and issues. So to me, therefore, what I've found from my work around this area is that when you start talking about target 4.7 of Sustainable Development Goals, you're talking in a much more holistic way of how you see things. And I found from some research I did looking at sustainability within the formal education system in England, was that it was posing questions about what is the wider purpose of education? What is education for? And it's not just, and to me, sustainable development, it's not just about education about sustainable development or for sustainable development. It's as much, I would suggest, about through sustainable development, how we see sustainability as touching all our lives and everything that we do. I just want to say a little bit about what's been happening at my own university, University College London, and because I think it's indicative of, I think, that the trends and changes that are taking place within many universities in the UK and elsewhere in the world. A decade ago, UCL was doing very little on the area of sustainability. You would have seen very little in terms of activities. There may be an odd nod to various things environmentally, but it wasn't seen as a high priority. A decade later, completely different, now a very high priority within the university. And these are sort of its commitments in its latest 5-year strategy to achieve by 2024. Now, why has this change taken place, and why is that happening in many universities around this country and the wider world? Obviously, the increased profile that sustainability and climate change has had in the media and amongst policymakers internationally. Also, is a recognition that as educationalists, we have a responsibility to respond to the big global challenges that we're all facing, and climate change and sustainability surely is the #1 challenge we're all facing. But thirdly, I would also suggest that there's been huge pressure and demand from students to say, if we're going to live in a sustainable way, we need to understand what that all means. And I think it's fair to say that for many of us who've now been teaching this field for a long period of time, we were probably not doing as much as we should have been doing around this area. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting when we look at these 6 commitments, the bottom 4 have to some extent been the easiest for the university to start to engage with. All right, there are questions about geography and so on. What has been more difficult is about how to increase research, increase research in this area, part because of lack of funding opportunities, despite the interest in it. And above all, the ensuring that every student has the opportunity to study and be involved in sustainability. For that to happen, that requires a commitment and support from academics and researchers and the whole university community. And that is not easy to achieve, and that often takes time, particularly if an academic is responsible for subject areas where sustainability is seen to be very much on the margins or not seen as particularly relevant to what they're teaching or doing research in. So I think what we've been trying to do at UCL is actually start conversations in a way to start to see where people are at, get a sense of what their understandings are, as I shall show toward the end of my talk, some courses and things that we're trying to develop for academics and researchers. But I think I would see this as like a work in progress, really. If we recognize those things, let's just remind ourselves about what's been happening and why I would see the need to think about this area of education and sustainable development in a more holistic way. Education sustainability was conceived at the Rio Summit in 1992, and the feature of that commitment was to see it as much more than being just about the environment. And successive UN initiatives have made reference to themes like quality of life, interconnectedness of environment and economy and society, and to bring some of those things more closely together. There, of course, alongside that, there has been, particularly in recent years, the growth of more social justice-based movements within universities. So some of these are obviously not new, but have had heightened profile in recent years, particularly around the area of themes like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and the whole areas of work around decolonization. And to me, some of these things have often been seen as run along parallel lines to those on the environment. And what I suppose theme of my talk is to say we need to look at how we can look at these things in the round and to look at things in a more holistic way, that when we start talking about environmental justice, at the same time, we have to be talking about social justice and social change. And those are the things I think that can often be challenging, because people, you know, we all end up in protecting our own little areas and corners of our own academic work. But the need to think outside the box and how we can make these connections to these areas is, I think, important. So, for example, at UCL, as well as being involved in work on sustainability, I've recently led some research on cultures of decolonization, quite deliberately, to see about how we see, not only seeing that is important, but to understand that it's covering many of the same themes, because we're talking about justice, we're talking about access, we're talking about engagement, and we're talking about trying to work towards a more just and sustainable world. But we have to recognize, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, that for many young people and for many students who come into higher education, there is an unease about the future of the planet and their role within it. Some of that has been engendered and possibly not helped by some media engagement in these areas, but we have to recognize there is a sense of unease. And these concerns have been responded to by many young people, not only just being anxious about it, but moving with a sense of anxiety to one of action and anger. And that, to me, is one of the things I've learned quite a lot in some of my recent engagement with students and young people in my own university, is how can we channel this enthusiasm and interest into some form of not just positive action, but to connect that to their deeper understanding. And so, therefore, to me, I would say that, therefore, in trying to bring these things together, that's where we need to start talking about climate justice, about environmental justice and social justice as a way of showing that what concerns young people, about that concerns the future. They are things that are not just about them in an individualistic sense. They ask the issues that are relevant to all people around the world. And that sense of bringing those things together is, I think, very important. And so to me, this sense of moving from a sense of anger, from a sense of anxiety to a sense of anger, and how you channel and respond to that anger is how I think one of our major priorities as educationalists and as academics in this country. And as Gerver states, we've got to recognize that as educators, and whatever field of academia we're involved in, we have to ensure that young people and students have the opportunity to engage with the world, to get a sense about understanding and what their role is, and to get a sense that they can be part of the process of trying to find solutions to engage in making a better place to live in. And I think we have, I would suggest, a collective responsibility for these issues. And we have a sense of how can we do this in a way that can be positive and can be engaging. And I think one of the challenges there is around when we talk about sustainability is it can end up being a very sometimes knowledge and content driven agenda. And what I would like to pose to you, what we need to be thinking much more, and particularly responding to the agendas and concerns of students, how we do this in a pedagogical sense that can be participatory, can be engaging, that can start from their concerns and issues, and how we can help them on their own journeys. And to me, that's why I've started to bring into my own work this concept of hope, because to me, the sense of hope is not some sense of some idealistic notion about we want the world to be a better place, but to bring into that sense of our educational world, that how can we engage with promoting a connection towards about sustainability, to a sense of improvement and that change, and how we engage people in that process themselves. Because to me, to be a good educator, you have to promote a sense of hope. If you're not doing that, you're not being a good educator. And I think that to me is can often be a challenge for many of us in terms of our daily lives. But to me, that's something I think we need to continue to think about in terms of what courses we might be teaching on, what research we might be engaging with, So we're doing that in the way that can be constructive and engaging people. So if we recognize those things, how then do we address that? So I've come up with one, which obviously heavily influenced by the ideas and thinking of Paulo Freire, is to develop what I'm calling a pedagogy of hope. And that means starting from understanding the concerns that many students may well have. They come to our universities about the state of the world, to understand where that's come from and what's the basis of that. And then to look at ways in which they can engage in addressing those challenges that enables them to locate their own experiences and their concerns within relationship what's happening in the wider world, that their concerns are not alone. Secondly, to move beyond what can often happen, partly I think because of the influence of social media, is to think about, there are quick fix solutions and the danger of superficial responses, and it's all about action and campaigning without understanding the complexities of the global problems that exist. And I think, I've been aware of some really good courses in universities that quite consciously pose problems and challenges and say that what are the ways in which we address these things, and to understand the different ways we get involved in these issues. And I think the sense about understanding what those problems are is, I think, to me, quite interesting, quite important. A number of years ago, I did quite a lot of work with people in the engineering world, and they talk to me and said, well, our problem is that we just focus on solutions. We don't engage enough in understanding the problems. And I think, to me, there's something there about how we can ensure that in all areas of our teaching and learning and our research, we try and make sure we look at the complexities of some of these issues. And also it means that when we start thinking about the concept of hope, that we're going beyond rather emotional responses to these issues, and to suggest there are different ways that we could respond and how we can engage in this way, that whilst recognizing some of these issues, some of these responses are going to be emotional, how can we promote a pedagogy that enables the learners to see the connections from their own concerns with the concerns of others, and how we can work together in a collective way to seek a more just and sustainable future. So to me, how do we ensure that we do this as educators? So these are quite obvious things, but I just wanted to reinforce them here today. One is that we need to make sure that in our lectures and our seminars and our own presentations, we are consistently presenting this air of positivity that change is possible. We need to bring, it doesn't mean we hide the stark realities of the state of the world, but actually we shouldn't leave students high and dry and left unsure about what to do. And we need to move beyond eco-anxiety to address concerns, but what can be done. And I think from that leads to a sense of engagement in social environmental issues, both within what courses that are being run, but what students might be doing out of their formal studies. And I think whatever subject they're involved with, I think a university has responsibility to say, how can we ensure that students have the opportunity to engage in these matters, whether it's through extracurricular activity, whether it's their own courses, and what are the places that this can happen. And many universities are doing this, but it's about actually how do we make sure that these things are done in a way that students can feel involved and informed and don't feel isolated and lost. And I've tried to bring some of these things together in a book I had published last year called Education for Social Change. And one of the things I found that in writing this book was that I was concerned there'd been a lot of rhetoric about the powerful role that education can play in changing society. But that hadn't really been seen in the context of how we connect that to themes around sustainability, being global citizens, and promoting a sense of hope and that change is possible. And so therefore, to me, what I've been trying to do in my more recent work is to see how all those things come together and how we can ensure that when we're tackling issues like climate change, we not so much, I won't say have a roadmap of how to resolve it, because there is not one quick solution, but actually there's a sense that people that can collectively see themselves as part of the process of securing change. So finally, what I just want to mention quite critically within my own couple of things I'm personally involved in. One is that within my own university, we run this online course for educators on education and sustainable development. And sort of the origins of this online sort of MOOC course is quite interesting. We'd already been running one on global education and learning about understanding the wider world, which was been very successful and very popular. But we were having conversations with academics and researchers and people responsible for professional development at university, saying that there's a need to look more at what sustainability means, to understand what it means. And so that academics and researchers and people involved in the professional side of university life can have a sense of understanding what these issues mean for them. So we developed this online course for educators, and which has only been going a few months, but what is interesting is the ways in which you can engage people from a whole range of backgrounds and courses. And it's a short 3-week course. You engage in it at your own level in your own way. And I think that to me is an example. I'm sure people come up with their own examples of ways in which they're trying to address these issues. The second area is that I'm involved, as I said at the beginning, of chair this international network on global education and learning, which includes lots of academics, particularly interested in sustainable development, and it's called the Angel Network. And what has been interesting about this international network is the ways in which there is increasing demand and interest for looking how people can work together in terms of courses and research on sustainability, not in a way that looking some common agendas, but actually identifying how we can learn from each other. Because I think it's fair to say that in lots of areas around sustainability, it has been very perceived as being very Western driven and very global North driven. And that what is happening much more now, I think, is that through the use of technology that we're using today, there's much increasing interaction with educators and academics from the global South. And we've found that one of the things that's underpinning some of our work in this network is how we can share that and promote that. And we're organizing a major conference in partnership with UNESCO in June in Paris. And one of the features of that is how we can all learn and share things together. So I suppose my questions to pose out to everyone is, how do we ensure sustainability becomes more than just a buzzword? And it's not something as the obvious thing that universities got to be seen about marketing and promoting themselves, but can be seen as a vehicle for posing wider questions about the purpose of education and learning. And to me, I'm also concerned that often sustainability has become seen as a green marketing tool in terms of performance and green league tables. I'm not saying that they're not important, but it's often that becomes the driver for things. Thirdly, what I'm interested in is how can we ensure that some of the creative initiatives around sustainability become seen to make closer connections to issues around global social justice, global inequalities, and themes like decolonization. UNESCO now talks about sustainability connected to transformative learning. To what extent are we starting to make connections between sustainability and transformative learning, that sustainability is more than just learning about, it's about how we change ourselves and our institutions? And finally, how can our universities become institutions of, for, and through social and environmental justice? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Douglas, and apologies for joining late. I did catch most of it. I joined very shortly after you started there. So, and apologies, colleagues. I'm not going to eat into too much of your important Q&A time, but suffice to say, my train was delayed by 2 hours this morning, so it was a bit of a rush to get here. So, but that was a fantastic presentation, and I just invite, I think I would thank my colleague Kim for stepping in and doing the welcome, and encourage colleagues who have questions for Doug, and I'm sure there's going to be many. If you prefer, you can post them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll invite you to unmute and put your questions in person. We have about just on 20 minutes for Q&A, so we can have a really good discussion here. I think just while people are framing their questions, I think I would, those provocations you have at the end, I would say, I think really important. And I really take your point about metrics. I think metrics have an important role in terms of encouraging leadership, shall we say, to pay attention to this issue. But most of the metrics just measure outputs, you know, how many things are we doing, and they don't really focus on outcomes. And I think it's that, absolutely agree with you, that it's that kind of transformative educational practice that's going to have the change in terms of outcomes for our students, for our colleagues, and for our community. So I think there were some brilliant reflections there. Right, I have rambled on enough, so colleagues, can I invite you to ask a question? Anybody want to go first? I'm sure there's lots of questions for Doug. Thank you, Shirley. Do you want to come in first, please? You want to unmute?
Hello, everybody. It's Shelley Bennett from Advance HE. It's not a question, really. It's more because my focus is here looking at fellowship and ESD, that I was struck by the slide talking about the importance of helping learners to be hopeful about the future in relation to sustainable development. And it's already flagged up a link for me between the learning environment and student support and educational for sustainable development that I hadn't thought of before. So thank you very much. But as I say, it's not really a question.
No, but it poses the point about thinking about sustainability in terms of well-being and quality of life, and I think those themes that have been sort of as undercurrents and discussions around ESD, but have never really been brought to the fore very much, particularly I would suggest within higher education. And I think that to me is and hopefully people start make connections to that. But that also means that we need to engage people who have those sorts of roles within higher education to be brought into some of these conversations more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Douglas. Sorry, Shirley, did you want to come back in there?
No, not at all. That's fine.
We're just thinking about how we support not just academics for taking that conversation forward, but also the academic developer community for understanding and bringing across those interconnections, I think, between disciplines. Which sort of brings me on to the question in the chat. Kathy Dabrow, I don't know if you want me to read it out for you or unmute and ask it yourself.
That's great. Thank you, Kay. Hi, Doug. Thanks so much for that. That was touched on. I love that framing of hope, and I think it's sometimes working in that space, it can be really difficult to know how to frame that exactly, depending on the teaching context or the learning context. But my question really involves this idea of bringing in other voices, of the idea of change happening where you get more perspectives and people to collaborate. And a lot of the education for sustainable development pedagogy speaks to that. But in reality, it can be really hard to engage that and to move that forward. So I wondered if you had any tips on maybe how you might have gone about engaging people across disciplines.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things we have at UCL, we have this initiative called Grand Challenges, all right? And there's going to be a new Grand Challenge that's going to be on climate change sustainability. But the whole underpinning of Grand Challenges is to provide funding and resources for collaborative and interdisciplinary initiatives across the university. So to encourage people who don't normally talk to each other, but to look at ways you can work together. And it seemed like almost like seed corn funding as a way of starting conversations. And I just know from my own experience of being in conversations with people in some of the life sciences, for example, who I normally wouldn't have daily contact with, and to see how we can work together on joint initiatives. And to me, sometimes that's where I think the role of the leadership within an institution is quite important, that actually to encourage movement on that, you've got to encourage those things, because we all know within our own academic life that we tend to drill down to our own specialism rather than to broaden outwards. And unfortunately, in an area of education where you have to do that, because that's what education is all about in its broader sense. But to me, that is just a small practical thing. And I'm aware of some really interesting initiatives where law working with arts are looking at question sustainability around buildings and designing things, and that for particular areas. And I think that may require some facilitation as well. Some of those initiatives may require people being brought into those processes who can bring the relevant, appropriate pedagogical approaches, and which don't always happen. But those are sorts of starting points I would suggest. There requires that sort of engagement, or you start to talk about things like we've just been mentioning, questions of well-being. So if you pose that as coming under sustainability banner, encouraging initiatives on that brings that moves those conversations forward.
Thanks, Douglas, and thank you for the question. And I think that really, I know we've got some great examples of interdisciplinary practice being shared over the next 2 days. And I see Georgie waiting to come in here as well. She is collating some examples, and we already have some on our website, some examples of great interdisciplinary. But I think that question really speaks to the key element of this, the theme of this symposium, is because a lot of that passion comes from the ground up, that people go, oh, it'd be great if I work with those guys over in engineering and social science to really understand this problem. But then you kind of need that kind of top-down facilitation to put the processes in place and go, well, how are we going to give credit for this? How are we going to get all these students in the same learning space? How are we going to timetable this? So then there's all those pragmatic things that you do need that kind of institutional buy-in. I'm going to invite Georgie to come in with all her vast expertise in this area. Hello, Georgie.
I'm not sure I need that introduction, Kay, but thank you. Thanks very much, Douglas, for a great sort of scene setting presentation for the symposium. And I just wanted to ask, based on your experience, and it seems appropriate at the start of a symposium to just raise what is sometimes the elephant in the room in terms of discussions of ESD in higher education, as to what do you see as being some of the big structural challenges in the way in which higher education institutions, at least in the UK, are organised? Where do you see the big challenges being in delivering that kind of vision that you've outlined there? And what do you think, conversely, to bring this a positive spin on this, what do you think universities are particularly good at that lends themselves to delivering ESD well?
If I take the last part first, I think universities are good in terms of some aspects of research and aspects of teaching, and looking at issues, and increasingly doing well at responding to concerns from students. And I think that there's increasing evidence of that. And I suppose that the challenge I pose is that, and it depends on the type and nature of the university. I'm at a Brussels Group University that's very discipline focused, and those that are not, I think, historically have had more creative space for some of these issues than some of the more traditional universities that are focused much more on subjects. And that, and I think, to me, that the biggest challenge is, I think, that how we can connect the whole theme of sustainability to much more about equipping graduates for the world they're going to be in the future. And it's about, I don't mean the dangers that's often done in a rather narrow economic sense, right? I'm involved in something next Monday, a video thing where I'm been asked to respond to some questions about green skills, and I hate the term green skills for the reasons that probably many do in this conversation, because it becomes very narrow and very technical. But what I wanted to agree to do that is because you've got to start with where some of those conversations are at, right? And I just saw something from DFE yesterday talking about preparing students for the green economy, right? And it was that it is taking a very narrow interpretation of green in a very environmental sense, talking about sustainability in a very economic sense. And I think the big challenge is how can we move, while recognizing that maybe the starting point, how can we move from that to talk about it in a much more holistic sense? And I think that's a real challenge, because I think politically it's a lot easier and safer to keep it in a very narrow environmental sense. So if you start talking about environmental justice and social justice, questions of decolonization and connect, that opens up a whole area that a lot of people, both not only politically, but often within higher education, find quite challenging. So I think the issue is actually, how do we do that? Moving as in a way that can be engaging and positive. And I think that's not easy. And it's not easy when we're in a political climate where there's hostility to those things.
Thank you. Yeah, I just to pick up on one aspect that you mentioned there about preparing students for the world they're going into. And I guess for me, that's also a challenge, because there are some elements that are pre-written in terms of climate change impacts, but there are other things that we want students to feel that they have the ability to shape the world that they're going into. And that in itself is a challenge. Anyway, thank you for your response.
Thanks, Georgie, and thanks for the question. And I really value that point about moving away from green skills and the green economy, because I know certainly when I've had conversations with colleagues and you talk about education for sustainable development, and they immediately go, oh, well, you know, that's not really got anything to do with me, because they see it through that lens of, you know, it's only about environmental issues, it's only about, you know, that very kind of narrow focus, and you need to help them kind of to broaden it out. And I think that actually kind of leads back into sort of Shirley's question earlier as well, about how we encourage all staff to kind of be able to reflect on this in terms of their professional development and their practice. So, you know, we've got all of those moving parts. Colleagues, we've got time for probably one or two more questions. I'm sure there must be people burgeoning to ask other questions. A lot of shy people with us today. Feel free, if you don't want to come on camera and just want to put it into the chat, please do, and I will read it out for you.
Okay, it's Andrew Reeves at DMU here. I can't find a way to put my hand up, so I'm just bursting in.
just jump in, that's perfect.
It was under reactions, but there's no option there. Anyway, so a thing I was wondering from Doug's point of view, because you're looking at this from a really international perspective because of the networks you're involved in. In the UK, we often find ourselves in the position of having to justify our work on ESD and sustainability because of the benefits for student recruitment, and it becomes this thing where we're trying to sort of make a kind of marketing justification around it, and that's to do with the context of our institutions, and we're in a fight to recruit students and stay alive financially. But I assume in many other countries it's not quite the same. So I'd be interested in how ESD is framed, and maybe seeds of hope for different framings from your international partners that you've worked with.
Yeah. I don't think there's quite as much difference as people might hope, really. I think it partly depends where you are. I think in a number of countries where there's more less pressure in terms of the funding regimes, there's more creative spaces. But I think there are equally the same number of challenges that you'd have that we've been talking about in terms of students and recruitment and the context of their involvement, and that would happen, I think, in many countries. I think what is not happening, I don't think, enough, is that international sharing of models or ways of engaging things, because the whole thing behind what I was saying was that the whole area around sustainability is a global question, and a lot of my writing has been around how you can promote students to be global citizens, and I think sometimes in the UK is particularly notoriously bad at this. It doesn't necessarily look at things in that global context, and so therefore if there are ways in which we could do more to encourage that collaboration and sharing, things much more difficult now with lack of funding from Europe. But to me, that is something I think I'd be very interested to hear about. And this doesn't mean about selling, you know, unfortunately, when I first got involved in this 20 years ago, people talk about international stuff, and it was seen about opening things out. It now become narrow to people start talking about global engagement, and that means that how can we sell what we've got to the rest of the world? What doesn't happen enough is that collaboration, and sustainability should be almost the top of that agenda if you're looking at collaboration, because of the things we're talking about. And that doesn't mean jet setting off to somewhere else around the world. We don't need to do that anymore. It's about how we can work collaboratively on projects. And I think that, to me, concerns me with the lack of funding and opportunities, particularly in the European context for UK universities, that some of that global outlook has become lessened, partly obviously because of Brexit, that makes some of these, I think, issues quite challenging because people see it in a very narrow sense. Right?
Yeah, I think I would add to that you know, obviously Advanced HE do a lot of work globally supporting both our member institutions that have got campuses overseas, and we've also got increasing number of overseas members. And I would say that one sort of topic that is rising rapidly up the agenda institutions in both the Middle East and Southeast Asia, where we're doing a lot of work, is sustainability. So that kind of gives me you know, some kind of positive you know, thinking about that this is really becoming increasingly important. But I'd also raise the issue, you know, I really think this idea of collaboration and the idea that we need to think a lot more creatively about transnational education to make it much more sustainable, and not have people flying about all over the place, and actually bringing students from the developing countries into the global north and keeping them here and depriving their home communities of all that kind of skill and talent. We need to think of ways of kind of yes, if they want a UK or a Western higher education, supporting them having that in country, and supporting them, you know, to develop their local talent and their local skills, and keeping it there, so that we start to have a more balanced view of the world. And I think just to sort of finish off that point, I think my last thing would be the Times Higher, who we work with a lot at Advanced HE, do a global survey of students. And in that survey, 82% of students say that they want to live as sustainable citizens. And also in that survey, they're seeing that they want, you know, it's becoming increasingly important to them that they study at an institution that is sustainable in its practice. So I think those kind of elements mean that everybody's pulling in the same direction, but we need to recognize that we're at different places on that journey. And I think the other issue, I think, you know, Douglas is obviously from a very prestigious university, and I'm sure has got institutions from around the world wanting to collaborate with them. But I think we need to kind of think about who do we want to collaborate, and we want to collaborate with institutions to help them come along. We don't just want to go and collaborate with other people that are also in that kind of top quartile of institutions. Let's think about how we can collaborate and really share our expertise and our knowledge in this such a critical area. So I feel as if I'm on a bit of a rant here, but anyway, we've got more in the chat, so I'll be quiet. Yeah, it's just another suggested. Oh yes, somebody sharing your paper for you, Douglas. You're too shy to do it. Colleagues, we are just about up. No, we've got time for one more question, I think. Sorry, apologies. Or are we up for time? Let me look at my agenda. I'm all over the place today. We are out of time. So I think that just leaves me to really thank Douglas for such a fantastic presentation. It was put in the chat how useful and provocative that was for the start of the symposium. And I think that kind of, you know, I did share the link to Hope is Imperative, the great book by David Orr, which is a really good read. You can get it secondhand, as I know my own experience. So if your library doesn't stock it, it's great to dip into just to get some different perspectives. Quite old now, but still you could sort of think how you know, just becoming more and more pertinent and more people engaging with that. Colleagues, some great comments there for you, Douglas, and lots of positive thoughts about your presentation. Colleagues, we are now going to split into two different parallel sessions. So I'm leading parallel session 1 in here, and there's you should have another link, which I think Lucy's putting them in the chat for us anyway, if you want to go to the other parallel session. And just in case you can't remember which session you were in, I'm leading off on session 1.1a and here with Claire, Crichton, Allen. So that's the session that will be in this on this Zoom link next. If you want the alternative, you've got a few minutes, 5 minutes to change Zoom link. So again, thank you, colleagues, for your questions and comments, and thank you so much for Douglas for such a real inspiration for us all as we start thinking about this. Thank you all very much.